Richard Harrison's world collapsed in one tragic moment 5 years ago, leaving him paralyzed and dependent on the woman he trusted most. But in the shadows of his mansion, someone was watching, someone who would risk everything to reveal a truth so devastating it would shake him to his core. But nobody imagined what would come next. Just before we start, this community spans every continent. Drop your city's name if you feel comfortable sharing. Once the most powerful real estate mogul on the West Coast sat motionless in his custom Italian leather wheelchair, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the perfectly manicured gardens he could no longer walk through. At 45, Richard still possessed the sharp features and commanding presence that had built his billion-dollar empire. But his legs remained as unresponsive as stone. 5 years had passed since the accident that changed everything, a construction site mishap that crushed his spine and, seemingly, his future. The doctors had been clear: complete spinal cord injury, no chance of recovery. "Good morning, darling." Helen's melodious voice floated across the room like silk. At 38, Helen Morrison was stunning in the way that turned heads at charity galas and board meetings. Her platinum blonde hair caught the morning light as she approached, carrying a crystal glass filled with a green concoction that had become as routine as breathing. "Your morning health drink," she said, placing a gentle kiss on his forehead before handing him the glass. Dr. Peterson's special blend: spinach, kale, ginseng, and those expensive supplements from Switzerland. You know how important consistency is for your recovery. Richard accepted the glass without enthusiasm. The bitter taste had never grown on him, but Helen insisted it was crucial for his health. She'd been his anchor through the darkest period of his life, transforming from his business associate to his devoted caretaker and fiancé. When everyone else saw a broken man, Helen saw the person he could still become. "The physical therapist will be here at 10, Helen continued, adjusting the cashmere throw across his legs with practiced efficiency. "And your mother called. She wants to know if we've set a date for the wedding yet." Richard's jaw tightened. The wedding had been postponed indefinitely since the accident. How could he ask Helen to marry half a man? "We've discussed this, Helen. I won't trap you in a marriage to an invalid." "Richard Harrison, you listen to me." Helen's voice carried that familiar mixture of tenderness and steel. "You are not an invalid. You're the man I fell in love with, accident or no accident. Your worth isn't measured by whether you can walk." From the doorway, Maria Santos observed the daily ritual with growing unease. At 23, Maria possessed her mother's quiet strength and observant nature. Rosa Santos had been the Harrison mansion's head housekeeper for 15 years. And Maria had grown up in the shadow of wealth she could never imagine possessing. She'd watched Richard build his empire, witnessed his transformation from driven businessman to devoted family man after the accident. But lately, something felt wrong. Maria moved silently through the room, straightening already perfect arrangements, dusting surfaces that gleamed like mirrors. Her presence was so subtle that wealthy people often forgot she existed, a skill that had become both blessing and curse. She'd learned to read the subtle tensions that rippled beneath the surface of polite conversation, the unspoken truths that hovered in corners like shadows. "Maria, dear." Helen's voice carried the particular tone reserved for household staff, polite but distant. "Would you mind preparing Mr. Harrison's lunch? He prefers the salmon today, I believe." "Of course, Miss Morrison," Maria replied, her accent carrying traces of her El Salvadoran heritage. She'd been born in Los Angeles, but her mother's homeland lived in her voice like a whispered prayer. As Maria headed toward the kitchen, she caught Richard's reflection in the hallway mirror. Something in his expression made her pause, a flash of longing so raw it made her chest tight. She'd seen that look before. in her own mother's eyes during the hardest times after her father's deportation. It was the look of someone trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The kitchen was Maria's sanctuary, all gleaming stainless steel and marble countertops that her mother maintained with religious devotion. Rosa was arranging fresh flowers, her weathered hands moving with the grace of someone who understood that beauty required constant tending. "Mija," Rosa looked up as Maria entered. "You look troubled. What weighs on your heart?" Maria hesitated. Her mother had taught her the importance of discretion in wealthy households. Gossip was a luxury they couldn't afford. But the feeling that had been growing stronger each day refused to be silenced. "It's Mr. Harrison, Mama. Something isn't right." Rosa's expression grew cautious. "What do you mean? Have you noticed how Miss Morrison prepares his drinks? She's so particular about it, and she never lets anyone else help with his medications." "She loves him deeply," Rosa said carefully. "It's natural for her to want to care for him personally. But what if?" Maria lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "What if she doesn't want him to get better?" The words hung in the air like a dangerous secret. Rosa's face went pale, and she glanced toward the door as if Helen might materialize from thin air. "Maria Elena Santos," Rosa's voice carried the weight of warning. "That is a terrible thing to suggest. Miss Morrison has devoted her life to caring for him. I know it sounds crazy, but think about it, Mama. If Mr. Harrison recovered, if he could walk again, would he still need her the same way? Would he still want to marry someone who— Who what?" Rosa's eyes narrowed. Maria struggled to articulate the feeling that had been eating at her for months. Someone who isn't really in love with him, but with what he represents, with his money, his status, his need for her. The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Helen's laughter from the sitting room. Rosa moved closer to her daughter, her voice dropping to match Maria's whisper. "Even if what you're suggesting were true, and I'm not saying it is, what could we do? We're just the help, Mija. People like us don't accuse people like them of such things. We'd be destroyed." Maria felt the familiar weight of their position settle on her shoulders. Her mother was right, of course. They existed in the Harrison household by permission, not by right. One word from Helen could eliminate their income, their home, their entire future. But as she prepared Richard's lunch, cutting the salmon into precise portions, Maria couldn't shake the image of his face in the mirror. The face of a man who'd lost hope not just of walking, but of living. Later that afternoon, Maria was cleaning the upstairs hallway when she heard Helen on the phone in the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and Helen's voice carried the particular quality it took on during private conversations, sharper, more calculating. "No, the timeline hasn't changed," Helen was saying. 5 years is long enough for anyone to accept that he'll never recover. The doctors have been consistent about that." Maria froze, her dust cloth suspended in mid-air. "Of course, I've considered what happens if he starts questioning things," Helen continued, "but he trusts me completely. Why would he suspect anything? As far as he knows, I'm the devoted fiancé sacrificing my prime years to care for an invalid." The word invalid, delivered with such cold precision, made Maria's stomach turn. "The will is already updated. Once we're married, everything transfers to me in the event of his death. And given his depression, his isolation. Well, accidents happen in houses this size." Maria's hands began to shake. She pressed herself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. 2 more months, Helen's voice carried a note of anticipation. 2 more months of playing the devoted caregiver, and then I'll be the wealthiest widow in California. The dustcloth slipped from Maria's numb fingers, landing on the marble floor with a soft whisper that seemed to echo like thunder in the silence. She bent to retrieve it, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd just heard. Helen Morrison wasn't just prolonging Richard's helplessness, she was planning his death. As Maria stumbled down the servants' staircase, her mind struggled to process the enormity of what she'd discovered. Richard Harrison, the man she'd watched laugh with genuine joy at childhood birthday parties, who'd helped her pay for her college applications, who'd treated her family with more respect than many wealthy people showed their own relatives. He was living with his would-be murderer. The worst part was how perfectly Helen played her role. The devoted fiancée, the selfless caregiver, the woman who'd sacrificed her own happiness for love. Everyone admired her dedication, praised her loyalty, envied Richard for finding such a devoted partner. But Maria had seen the truth hiding behind Helen's perfect mask. The question that tormented her as she mechanically completed her duties was simple and impossible. How could she save a man who would never believe he needed saving? Maria had barely slept, her mind churning with Helen's overheard conversation and the terrible weight of knowledge she carried alone. She'd arrived at work 2 hours early, hoping the familiar routine of household tasks might provide some clarity. Instead, every corner of the mansion seemed to whisper accusations she couldn't prove, secrets she couldn't share. Rosa found her in the laundry room at 5:30, folding sheets with mechanical precision, while tears streamed silently down her face. "Misha, what's wrong?" Rosa pulled her daughter into the embrace that had comforted her through every childhood nightmare and adolescent heartbreak. The whole story poured out in whispered Spanish. Helen's phone conversation, the casual mention of Richard's death, the cold calculation behind the mask of devotion. Rosa listened in growing horror, her face aging years in minutes. "Dios mío," Rosa breathed when Maria finished. "Are you certain you heard correctly?" "Every word, Mama. She's not just keeping him paralyzed, she's planning to kill him." Rosa sank onto a stool, her legs suddenly unable to support her. But how? The doctors said his injury was permanent. The specialists, the tests. "I don't know how she's doing it," Maria admitted, "but I know what I heard, and I know what I've observed. The way she controls every aspect of his care, the way she never lets anyone else prepare his food or medications. There has to be something." They sat in silence as the mansion slowly awakened around them. Somewhere above, Richard was beginning another day of captivity he didn't even recognize, while his captor played the role of devoted caregiver with Academy Award precision. "We have to tell someone," Maria said finally. "Who?" Rosa's pragmatism cut through hope like a blade. "The police? They'll ask for proof we don't have. Mr. Harrison himself? He won't believe us. He's completely under her spell. His family? They all adore Helen and think she's a saint for staying with him." The truth of her mother's words settled over Maria like lead. They were trapped by their position, their lack of credibility, their inability to prove something so monstrous that no one would want to believe it anyway. "There has to be a way," Maria insisted. "Perhaps," Rosa said carefully, "but it would require great courage and greater risk. Are you prepared for what might happen if you're wrong, or if you're right but can't prove it?" Before Maria could answer, the soft chime of the service elevator announced someone's early morning descent. They quickly separated, Rosa heading to the kitchen while Maria gathered the folded linens and prepared to face another day of watching a man slowly die while believing himself loved. Helen appeared in the kitchen at 7 sharp, already perfectly dressed and made up despite the early hour. Her routine never varied: Richard's morning health drink first, then her own coffee, followed by a review of the day's schedule with Rosa. "Good morning, Rosa." Helen's voice carried its usual warmth, but Maria heard the performance in it now. "I trust you slept well?" "Yes, Miss Morrison, thank you." "Wonderful. I'll need the usual preparation for Richard's drink." The blender should be perfectly clean. You know how sensitive his stomach has become. Maria watched from the corner where she was arranging fresh flowers, her hands steady despite the storm raging inside her. Helen moved with familiar efficiency, removing ingredients from specific cabinets with practiced ease: spinach, kale, protein powder, various supplements in unmarked bottles. But it was the small vial Helen retrieved from her purse that made Maria's breath catch. Helen glanced around quickly, then added several drops of clear liquid to the mixture before blending everything together. The motion was so smooth, so practiced, that it was clearly part of a long-established routine. Maria forced herself to continue arranging flowers, her mind racing. Whatever was in that vial, it wasn't part of any doctor's prescription. It was Helen's secret ingredient, the key to keeping Richard Harrison trapped in his wheelchair. "Rosa, I'll be out this afternoon for my yoga class," Helen said as she poured the green mixture into Richard's crystal glass. "Maria can handle any cleaning that needs to be done upstairs." The casual manipulation made Maria's skin crawl. Helen was creating an opportunity to be alone with Richard, probably to administer whatever additional substances were keeping him imprisoned in his own body. As Helen left the kitchen carrying Richard's morning drink, Maria made a decision that would change everything. "Mama," she whispered urgently, "I'm going to follow her. I need to see exactly what she does." "Maria, no. It's too dangerous." More dangerous than letting her kill him. Maria's voice carried a steel her mother had never heard before. "I can't stand by and watch this happen. I won't." Maria slipped out of the kitchen and up the servants' staircase, her soft shoes making no sound on the marble steps. She positioned herself in the small alcove near the sitting room, where decorative screens provided perfect camouflage. Richard was already at his desk, reviewing financial documents with the sharp focus that had made him a billionaire. Even confined to a wheelchair, he commanded respect and attention. His mind remained as sharp as ever. It was only his body that had been stolen from him. "Good morning, darling." Helen's performance began again. "How are you feeling today?" "Same as every day." Richard's voice carried a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Trapped in a body that won't obey me. The doctor said it would take time. 5 years isn't that long in terms of spinal cord recovery." Maria wanted to scream. There was no recovery to wait for if Helen was actively preventing it. "Here's your morning blend," Helen said, handing him the glass. "I added extra ginseng today. Dr. Peterson thinks it might help with your energy levels." Richard accepted the drink with the resignation of routine. But as he raised it to his lips, Maria noticed something that made her heart race. His hand trembled slightly just for a moment, as if his body was fighting against something. "Helen," Richard said suddenly, lowering the glass, "I've been thinking about getting a second opinion. Maybe seeing that specialist in Switzerland you mentioned." Helen's mask slipped for just an instant, and Maria caught a flash of something cold and calculating in her eyes before the loving concern returned. "Of course, darling. Whatever makes you feel more hopeful. Though I'd hate for you to get your hopes up only to be disappointed again." "I know the chances are slim," Richard said, raising the glass again, "but I have to try something. I feel like I'm slowly dying in this chair." "Don't say that." Helen moved closer, her hand resting on his shoulder with apparent tenderness. "You're not dying. You're healing, just not in the way you expected." Richard drank the entire contents of the glass, and Maria watched in horror as Helen's lips curved in what could have been a smile or a grimace. Within minutes, Richard's energy seemed to drain away like water from a broken vessel. His shoulders sagged, his head dropped slightly, and the fire that had been building in his eyes dimmed to barely glowing embers. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice slurring slightly. "I don't know why I get these periods of clarity, I guess, followed by such exhaustion. It's the injury, darling. Your brain is working overtime to compensate for the damaged pathways. The fatigue is normal. Normal. The word made Maria want to vomit. Nothing about this was normal except Helen's ability to lie with such convincing sincerity. As Helen helped Richard settle back in his chair, adjusting pillows and ensuring his comfort with the devotion of a saint, Maria realized she was watching a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Helen had perfected the art of keeping Richard dependent while making him grateful for his dependence. Later that morning, while Helen was on one of her frequent phone calls, Maria seized her opportunity. She slipped into the kitchen and examined the cabinet where Helen stored Richard's supplement bottles. Most were standard vitamins and minerals, but several were in unmarked containers that could hold anything. The small vial from Helen's purse was nowhere to be found. She'd obviously taken it with her. But Maria memorized the arrangement of bottles, the labels she could read, anything that might provide a clue to Helen's method. "Can I help you with something?" Maria spun around to find Helen standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "I was just checking if we need to reorder any of Mr. Harrison's supplements," Maria said, proud that her voice remained steady. How thoughtful. "But I handle all of Richard's medical needs personally. I wouldn't want there to be any confusion about dosages or timing." The warning was clear, delivered with Helen's characteristic smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Of course, Miss Morrison. I just wanted to be helpful." "I appreciate your dedication to Richard's well-being," Helen said, moving closer. "He's lucky to have such caring people around him, though of course too much attention from staff can sometimes make patients feel uncomfortable, like they're being watched rather than cared for." Maria nodded and retreated, but she'd gotten the message loud and clear. Helen knew she was being observed, and she was establishing boundaries that could become threats if crossed. That afternoon, while Helen was at her yoga class, Maria found Richard alone in his study. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment she saw the man he'd been before the accident, sharp, commanding, fully present. "Maria," he said, his voice clearer than it had been that morning. "I don't often get the chance to speak with you alone. How are your college applications going?" "They're going well, Mr. Harrison. Thank you for asking." He studied her face with the intensity that had made him a master negotiator. "You look troubled. Is everything all right?" This was her moment, possibly her only chance to plant a seed of doubt in his mind. But looking at his trusting expression, Maria realized the enormity of what she was about to attempt. She was going to try to convince a man that the woman he loved was slowly killing him. "Mr. Harrison," she began carefully, "has anyone ever suggested that you might benefit from different care, a different approach to your recovery?" His eyes sharpened with interest. "What do you mean?" "I've been reading about spinal cord injuries," Maria lied smoothly. "There are new treatments, different specialists. Sometimes a fresh perspective can make all the difference." "Helen handles all my medical care," Richard said automatically. "She's incredibly thorough, researches everything." "I'm sure she does," Maria agreed. "But sometimes the people closest to us can be too protective, too afraid of disappointment to explore all options." She watched as the idea took root, saw the flicker of possibility in his eyes before doubt crept in. "Helen has sacrificed everything for me," Richard said firmly. "Her career, her social life, her chance at a normal relationship. She wouldn't do anything to prevent my recovery." "Of course not," Maria agreed quickly. "I just meant that maybe you could take more control of your own care, make some decisions independently, just to feel more empowered in your own healing." Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the gardens where autumn was painting the leaves in shades of gold and crimson. "You know," he said finally, "there are moments when I feel different. Stronger, like maybe there's more possibility than I've been told." "When do you feel that way?" Maria asked carefully. "Usually in the mornings before." He paused, a strange expression crossing his face. "Before I have my health drink. It's odd, isn't it? You'd think the nutrients would make me feel stronger, not weaker." Maria's heart pounded so hard she was certain he could hear it. "That is strange," she managed. "Maybe I should try skipping it one morning," Richard mused, "just to see if there's a difference." "That might be worth trying," Maria said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. The sound of Helen's car in the driveway interrupted their conversation. Richard's expression immediately shifted, becoming more guarded, as if he'd been caught in some act of rebellion. "Don't mention our conversation to Helen," he said quickly. "She worries enough about my state of mind without thinking I'm questioning her care." "Of course not, Mr. Harrison." As Maria left the study, she felt a spark of hope for the first time since discovering Helen's true nature. She'd planted the seed. Whether it would grow into the doubt that could save Richard's life remained to be seen. But for the first time in days, Maria believed there might be a chance. The next morning arrived grey and heavy, with the kind of October rain that turned the Harrison Mansion's gardens into a watercolor painting of muted browns and golds. Maria arrived at work to find the household already stirring with unusual energy. Helen was pacing the kitchen with barely contained agitation, while Rosa prepared breakfast with careful, deliberate movements. "Is everything all right, Miss Morrison?" Rosa asked with the careful diplomacy she'd perfected over 15 years of service. Richard was restless last night, Helen replied, her fingers drumming against the marble countertop. He kept talking about trying new treatments, getting second opinions. "I'm worried he's setting himself up for another devastating disappointment." Maria busied herself with arranging fresh flowers, but her ears were tuned to every word. Something had changed overnight. Richard was questioning things more than he had in years. "Perhaps hope is good for him," Rosa suggested gently. "Even if nothing comes of it, feeling actively involved in his care might improve his spirits." Helen's laugh had an edge that made Maria's skin crawl. "Hope can be cruel, Rosa. I've spent 5 years protecting him from false promises and miracle cures that prey on desperate people. The last thing he needs is to waste energy chasing impossible dreams." As Helen began her ritual preparation of Richard's morning drink, Maria noticed the woman's movements were less precise than usual. She fumbled with one of the unmarked bottles, nearly dropping it before catching it against her chest. When she reached for the small vial from her purse, her hands were visibly shaking. Richard was awake and alert when Helen brought him his breakfast, more animated than Maria had seen him in months. He'd already reviewed 3 financial reports and was deep in conversation with his business manager on the phone when Helen interrupted with his morning health drink. "I need to take this call," Richard said, gesturing to the phone. "Can you leave the drink on the table? I'll have it in a few minutes." Helen's mask of patient understanding didn't quite hide her irritation. "It's better if you drink it fresh, darling. The nutrients begin to break down after 15 minutes. 5 minutes won't matter," Richard said firmly, returning his attention to the phone. Maria watched Helen's internal struggle play out across her face. She couldn't insist without seeming controlling, but she clearly didn't want to leave Richard alone with the drink for any length of time. Finally, with obvious reluctance, she placed the glass on his side table and retreated to her own morning routine. The moment Helen left the room, Maria seized her chance. She appeared at Richard's elbow with a fresh cup of coffee, positioning herself where she could see both the drink and the doorway. "Your coffee, Mr. Harrison," she said quietly, setting it down with deliberate ceremony. Richard covered the phone's mouthpiece. "Thank you, Maria. And thank you for our conversation yesterday. It got me thinking." "About what, sir?" "About taking more control of my own recovery, starting with small things." He glanced at the green mixture on his side table, then back at Maria. "Would you mind refreshing that drink?" It's been sitting for a while, and Helen says the nutrients break down. Maria's heart raced. Of course, Mr. Harrison. She picked up the glass and headed toward the kitchen, but instead of refreshing the drink, she took it to the small pantry where she quickly poured the contents down the sink. Then she prepared a fresh mixture using only the labeled, recognizable ingredients: spinach, kale, protein powder, and standard vitamins. When she returned, Richard was finishing his phone call. He accepted the fresh drink with a grateful smile and consumed it without hesitation. "Much better," he said. "Thank you for thinking of it." Throughout the morning, Maria watched for changes in Richard's demeanor. Unlike every other day she could remember, his energy didn't seem to drain away after consuming his health drink. If anything, he appeared more alert as the hours passed. Helen returned from her errands around lunchtime to find Richard reviewing architectural plans for a new development project, with more engagement than he'd shown in business matters for months. "You seem energetic today," Helen observed, her tone carefully neutral. "I feel good," Richard replied, and there was genuine surprise in his voice. "Really good, clear-headed, focused. Maybe those new vitamins you added are working." Helen's smile was perfect, but Maria caught the flash of confusion in her eyes. "I'm so glad, darling. Though you shouldn't overexert yourself. Your body is still healing." "I know my limits," Richard said with more conviction than he'd shown in years. "But I'm tired of being afraid of everything. Tired of treating myself like an invalid who might break at any moment." The word invalid, the same word Helen had used so dismissively on the phone, hung in the air like an accusation. Helen's composure flickered again before she recovered. "Of course, I just worry about you pushing too hard and having a setback." That afternoon, while Helen was meeting with the wedding planner to discuss their perpetually postponed ceremony, Maria found Richard in the mansion's home gym. He was transferring himself from his wheelchair to an exercise bench with more strength and coordination than she'd ever witnessed. "Mr. Harrison," she said, unable to hide her amazement. "You look so much stronger today." "I feel stronger," he admitted, completing the transfer with only minimal assistance from the parallel bars. "It's the strangest thing. Like fog is lifting from my brain and my body. I keep thinking I should call Dr. Peterson and tell him about the improvement." "That's wonderful news," Maria said, meaning every word. "Maria," Richard's voice took on a more serious tone, "I want to ask you something. And I need you to be completely honest with me." Her pulse quickened. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. In your observations around the house, have you ever noticed anything unusual about my care routine? Anything that seemed odd or inconsistent?" The question hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or refuse to acknowledge. Maria thought of her mother's warnings, of their precarious position in the household, of the impossibility of proving what she suspected. But she also thought of Helen's phone conversation, of Richard's gradual deterioration, of the cold calculation behind the mask of devotion. "Mr. Harrison," she said carefully, "I've noticed that you seem most alert and energetic in the mornings, before your health drink, and that your energy typically decreases significantly afterward." Richard was quiet for a long moment, processing this observation. "You've been paying attention." "I care about your well-being, sir. We all do. And Helen's role in preparing my medications and supplements. You've observed that too?" "Yes, sir. She's very particular about maintaining control over every aspect of your care." "Particular," Richard repeated the word thoughtfully. "Yes, she is that." They were interrupted by the sound of Helen's voice calling from the main floor. "Richard, where are you, darling?" "I should go," Maria said quickly. "But Mr. Harrison, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, investigate it. You have every right to understand exactly what's going into your body." As Maria hurried from the gym, she heard Richard's voice behind her, stronger and more determined than it had sounded in years. "I intend to." That evening, Maria stayed late to help Rosa prepare for a dinner party Helen was hosting for Richard's business associates. As they worked, Maria shared the day's developments in whispered Spanish. "He's getting suspicious," Rosa said, her voice tight with worry. "If Helen realizes what's happening." "She already knows something's different," Maria replied. "I saw her watching him all afternoon, trying to figure out why he's more alert than usual." "This is dangerous, mija. We're walking on the edge of a cliff. But Mama, he's getting better. Just one day, without whatever she's been giving him, and he's like a different person. What if we're his only chance?" Rosa looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and terror. "Then we pray we're strong enough to save him, and that we survive what comes next." Upstairs, Richard Harrison sat alone in his study, staring at the architectural plans spread across his desk, but seeing something else entirely. For the first time in 5 years, his mind felt completely clear, his thoughts sharp and focused as they'd been in his pre-accident life. The implications of his improved condition were staggering. If one day without his usual routine could produce such dramatic results, what did that say about the previous 5 years of steady decline? He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. "Dr. Peterson? This is Richard Harrison. I need to schedule an appointment, tomorrow if possible. I have some questions about my treatment that can't wait." As he hung up the phone, Richard heard Helen's footsteps on the marble stairs. She appeared in his doorway moments later, her expression bright with the kind of loving concern that had once comforted him but now seemed somehow calculated. "How was your day, darling?" she asked, moving to massage his shoulders with practiced tenderness. "Enlightening," Richard replied, and for the first time in their relationship, he didn't elaborate. Helen's hands stilled for just a moment against his shoulders, and in that pause, Richard felt the shift in their dynamic, like a tectonic plate moving beneath his feet. The game, whatever it was, had begun to change. Richard wheeled himself across the polished floors with more strength and coordination than he'd possessed in recent memory, his mind sharp with questions that demanded answers. "Richard," Dr. Peterson's surprise was evident as he entered the examination room. "You look remarkably well. Helen told me you'd been having some difficult days lately." "When did you speak with Helen?" Richard's voice carried an edge that made the doctor pause. "She called yesterday evening, concerned about your state of mind. She mentioned you'd been questioning your treatment plan and seemed agitated about your progress." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Helen had called ahead to manage the conversation, to frame Richard's questions as symptoms of depression or delusion rather than legitimate medical inquiry. "Dr. Peterson, I need you to run some tests," Richard said, his businessman's instincts taking over. "Blood work, neurological assessment, everything. I want to know exactly what's in my system and get a complete evaluation of my current condition." "Richard, we've been through this before. Your injury was thoroughly documented, and while your attitude today is encouraging, the fundamental damage to your spinal cord hasn't changed." "Humor me," Richard's tone brooked no argument. "I'm paying for these tests, and as your patient, I have the right to comprehensive medical evaluation whenever I request it." Dr. Peterson's professional demeanor shifted slightly. "Of course. Though I should mention that Helen has been instrumental in coordinating your care. She's provided detailed logs of your medications, symptoms, and progress. Any changes to your treatment should really be discussed with her." "I'm discussing them with you," Richard said firmly. "My fiancé's devotion is admirable, but I'm still capable of making my own medical decisions." As the nurse drew blood and Dr. Peterson conducted a thorough neurological examination, Richard felt sensations in his legs that had been absent for years. Not movement but awareness, tingling, the beginning of something that felt almost like hope. "This is interesting," Dr. Peterson murmured, testing Richard's reflexes. Your responses are more pronounced than they've been in our recent visits. Have you made any changes to your routine? I skipped my morning health drink yesterday, Richard said, watching the doctor's face carefully. Just wanted to see if it made any difference. And did it? See for yourself. Dr. Peterson completed his examination in thoughtful silence. I'll have the blood work results in 24 hours. In the meantime, I want you to keep a detailed log of any changes you experience. And Richard, if you're feeling stronger, that's genuinely encouraging. Sometimes recovery happens in ways we don't expect. Sometimes, Richard agreed, people recover from things others don't want them to recover from. Back at the mansion, Helen was waiting in the circular driveway, her expression a masterpiece of loving concern with undertones of barely controlled anxiety. "How was your appointment, darling?" she asked, as his driver helped him transfer back to his wheelchair. "Enlightening," Richard replied, using the same word that had unsettled her the previous evening. "What did Dr. Peterson say about your improved energy?" "He found it interesting. We're running additional tests to get a complete picture of my current condition." Helen's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "More tests?" "Richard, you've been poked and prodded for 5 years. Don't you think it's time to accept your condition and focus on living the best life possible within your limitations?" "I'm not ready to accept limitations that might not be permanent," Richard said, wheeling himself toward the house with newfound determination. That afternoon, Maria found herself alone with Helen for the first time since beginning her dangerous game of substitution. Helen was arranging flowers in the sitting room, her movements precise but agitated. "Maria," Helen's voice carried that particular tone reserved for important conversations. "I've noticed Mr. Harrison seems to have more energy lately. Have you observed anything different about his routine?" The question was delivered casually, but Maria heard the steel beneath the silk. "He does seem more alert, Miss Morrison. Perhaps the new vitamins are working." "Perhaps." Helen continued arranging the flowers, but her attention was focused entirely on Maria. "It's interesting how sometimes the smallest changes can have the biggest effects. A different preparation method, a missed dose, even the timing of when someone takes their medications." "I'm sure his improvement is because of your excellent care," Maria replied carefully. "I hope so." Helen's smile was razor-sharp. "Because if someone were interfering with Richard's treatment, thinking they were helping but actually causing harm, well, that would be tragic, wouldn't it?" The threat was clear, delivered with Helen's characteristic elegance. Maria nodded and excused herself, but she could feel Helen's eyes following her every movement. That evening, Richard made an announcement that changed the entire dynamic of the household. "I've decided to take a more active role in my own care," he told Helen over dinner. "Starting tomorrow, I want to prepare my own meals and handle my own medications. I think the independence will be good for my mental health." Helen's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Richard, that's not necessary. I'm happy to continue coordinating everything. It's no trouble at all." "I know, and I appreciate everything you've done. But I need to feel like I have some control over my own life. Surely you can understand that." "Of course." Helen's voice remained steady, but Maria noticed her hands were trembling slightly. "Though I worry about you managing the complex timing of your supplements. Some of them have very specific requirements about when and how they're taken." "Then you can teach me," Richard said simply. "Show me exactly what I've been taking and when. Complete transparency." The request hung in the air like a challenge neither combatant could ignore. Helen's mask of loving support never slipped, but Maria saw something cold and calculating flash through her eyes. "Naturally, darling. We'll go through everything together tomorrow morning." That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She paced her small room above the garage, torn between hope and terror. Richard was taking control, asking the right questions, demanding answers. But Helen had 5 years of practice in manipulation and control, and she clearly wasn't going to surrender without a fight. Around midnight, Maria heard a car start in the driveway. She looked out her window to see Helen's Mercedes disappearing into the darkness. Where would someone go at midnight when their carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble? The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather that transformed the mansion's gardens into a riot of autumn color. Richard was already in his study when Helen appeared with his morning health drink. But this time he wasn't alone. Maria was there with fresh coffee, and Rosa was adjusting the flowers on his desk. "Good morning, everyone," Helen's voice carried forced cheer. "Richard, your drink is ready. Same recipe as always." "Actually," Richard said, "I'd like to prepare it myself this morning. You can show me which ingredients to use." "That's not necessary. I insist." Richard's tone was pleasant but immovable. "I want to understand exactly what's going into my body." Helen glanced around the room, clearly uncomfortable with the audience. "Perhaps we could do this privately. I don't want to bore Rosa and Maria with medical details." "They're part of the household," Richard said. "If they're going to help with my care, they should understand it too." The trap was perfectly laid. Helen couldn't refuse without seeming unreasonable, but proceeding meant exposing her methods to witnesses she couldn't control. "Of course," she said finally. "Let's go to the kitchen." The small procession made its way to the kitchen, where Helen began removing ingredients from various cabinets. Her movements were less confident than usual, and Maria noticed she didn't reach for her purse. "Spinach, kale, protein powder." Helen listed each ingredient as she placed it on the counter. "These vitamin D tablets, calcium, omega-3 supplements." "What about the liquid additives?" Richard asked. "I've noticed you sometimes add drops of something." "Vitamin B complex," Helen said quickly. "Liquid form is more easily absorbed." "May I see the bottle?" Helen hesitated for just a moment too long. "I think I left it upstairs." "I'll get it later." "I'll wait," Richard said pleasantly. The standoff stretched for several uncomfortable seconds before Helen finally retrieved a small bottle from her purse. But Maria had observed Helen's routines for weeks, and she knew this wasn't the same vial she'd seen Helen use before. Richard examined the label carefully. "Vitamin B complex," he read aloud. "Standard dosage, nothing unusual, but you mentioned Dr. Peterson recommended something special from Switzerland. Where are those supplements?" "This is the Swiss formula," Helen said, but her voice had lost its usual confidence. "Strange," Richard mused. "The label says it's manufactured in New Jersey." The moment stretched like a taut wire about to snap. Helen's perfect composure finally began to crack, and Maria saw something desperate flash across her features. "Richard, you're being paranoid," Helen said, her voice taking on a sharp edge she usually kept hidden. 5 years of caring for you, of sacrificing my entire life. And now you're treating me like some kind of criminal." "I'm not treating you like anything," Richard replied calmly. "I'm simply asking questions about my own medical care. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps we should examine why." The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft hum of appliances and the distant sound of gardeners working on the grounds. Maria felt like she was witnessing the moment when a carefully constructed lie finally met immovable truth. "I need some air," Helen said abruptly. "This interrogation is giving me a headache." She left the kitchen with quick, sharp steps that echoed through the marble corridors. Richard stared after her, his expression thoughtful and increasingly grim. "Rosa, Maria," he said finally, "I need to ask you both something, and I need complete honesty. Have either of you ever noticed anything unusual about my care routine? Anything that seemed odd or raised questions in your minds?" The two women exchanged glances, a lifetime of caution warring with growing concern for the man who had treated them with more respect than most wealthy employers. "Mr. Harrison," Rosa said carefully, "we have noticed things, but we are just household staff. It is not our place to question. It is your place if you think someone is being harmed," Richard interrupted gently. "I give you permission, I give you my blessing, to tell me anything you've observed that concerned you." Maria took a deep breath and made the decision that would change everything. "She adds something to your drink that isn't vitamins," she said quietly. "Something from a small vial she keeps in her purse. And I heard her on the phone talking about your will, about accidents happening in large houses, about being a wealthy widow." The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water, creating ripples that would transform everything they touched. Richard's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, recognition, anger, and finally, cold determination. "How long?" he asked. "I don't know how long she's been doing it," Maria admitted, "but I've been watching for 2 weeks since I overheard the phone call. And yesterday, when you refreshed my drink, I made it fresh with only the ingredients I could identify, no mysterious additives." Richard closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them, Maria saw the full force of the intelligence that had built a billion-dollar empire. "Ladies," he said quietly, "I believe you may have saved my life." Richard said. It wasn't a question. "I came back for my phone." Helen's voice was barely above a whisper. I heard. "The truth," Richard finished. "You heard the truth about what you've been doing to me for 5 years." Helen's composure cracked completely. The mask of devoted caregiver slipped away, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "You don't understand what you're talking about. These women are jealous. They're trying to turn you against me." "Maria, Rosa." Richard's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Please leave us alone, but don't go far." The two women hurried from the kitchen, leaving Richard and Helen facing each other across a battlefield of shattered glass and exposed lies. "Sit down, Helen," Richard said quietly. "I don't want to sit down. I want to explain." "Sit down!" The roar came from somewhere deep inside Richard, the voice of a man who had commanded boardrooms and built an empire through sheer force of will. Helen sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. 5 years, Richard said, his voice deadly calm. 5 years of being told I was a hopeless invalid. 5 years of depression, of feeling like half a man, of wondering if life was worth living. And all the time, you were the one keeping me in this chair. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," Helen whispered. "The accident was real. The doctors said you might never walk again." "Might never, not would never. What did you give me, Helen? What was in that little vial?" Helen's silence stretched until Richard's patience snapped. "What did you give me?" "Muscle relaxants," she whispered. "High-dose muscle relaxants and mild sedatives, just enough to prevent nerve regeneration, to keep you weak and dependent." The confession hung in the air like a death sentence. Richard stared at the woman he had planned to marry, the woman he had trusted with his life, his recovery, his future. "Why?" The word came out broken, desperate. "Because I loved you," Helen said, tears streaming down her face. "Because you were everything I had ever wanted, and I knew that if you recovered, you'd leave me. You'd go back to your old life, your old priorities. You'd find someone younger, stronger, someone who hadn't seen you at your weakest. So you kept me weak. I kept you mine." Richard closed his eyes, and when he opened them, Helen saw something that terrified her more than anger, complete and utter disgust. "You didn't keep me, Helen. You stole me. You stole 5 years of my life, my mobility, my hope, my sense of self-worth. You watched me contemplate suicide and did nothing because it served your purposes. I stopped you from making that mistake. You caused that despair." Richard's voice shook the kitchen windows. Every moment of darkness, every night I lay awake wondering if I should just end it all. Every time I felt like a burden to everyone around me. That was your doing. Helen was sobbing now, but her tears only fed Richard's rage. And Maria overheard you planning my death. Not just theft, Helen, murder. You were going to kill me. I wouldn't have actually. Yes, you would have. Because I was getting suspicious, wasn't I? I was asking questions, wanting second opinions. Your perfect crime was falling apart, so you were ready to move to the final phase. The kitchen door opened quietly, and Maria appeared with a small device in her hand. "Mr. Harrison," she said softly, "I've been recording this conversation on my phone. I thought you might need proof." Helen's face went from white to gray. "You can't. That's not legal." "Actually," Richard said, "in California, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation. I consent. We have everything we need." Helen stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "I won't let you destroy me. I gave you the best years of my life. I deserve something for that sacrifice." "Sacrifice?" Richard's laugh was bitter. "You sacrificed nothing." "Helen, you invested 5 years in a plan to steal my fortune, and when that seemed threatened, you were ready to kill me for it. That's not sacrifice, that's premeditated murder." "No jury would convict me," Helen said, and for a moment her old calculating nature reasserted itself. "A devoted fiancée who cared for her disabled partner for 5 years. They'll see me as a victim of your paranoid delusions." "Will they?" Richard pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. "Because I've been recording our conversation too. And yesterday's blood work came back this morning, Doctor. Peterson found traces of benzodiazepines and muscle relaxants in my system, drugs that were never prescribed to me." Helen's face crumpled as she realized the trap she'd walked into. Richard had been several steps ahead of her, gathering evidence while she still believed she was in control. "I called the police before our conversation started," Richard continued. "They should be here any minute. I wanted to hear you confess, to understand why someone I loved could do something so monstrous. Now I know." The sound of sirens in the distance punctuated his words. Helen looked around the kitchen like a trapped animal, her eyes wild with desperation. "Richard, please," she whispered. "We can work this out. I'll stop the treatments, help you recover. We can start over." "Start over." Richard's voice was filled with wonder at her audacity. "Helen, you poisoned me for 5 years and planned to murder me. There's no starting over from attempted murder." The sirens grew louder, and through the kitchen windows they could see police cars turning into the circular driveway. "I did love you," Helen said desperately. "Everything I did was because I loved you." "No," Richard said quietly. "Everything you did was because you loved my money, my status, the power that came from controlling me. You never loved me, Helen. You don't even know what love is." Detective Sarah Chen was the first officer through the door, followed by 2 uniformed policemen. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of presence that commanded attention. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Detective Chen. We spoke on the phone." "Detective?" Richard nodded toward Helen, who was now slumped in her chair like a broken doll. "I'd like to report an attempted murder and assault with intent to cause bodily harm. This woman has been systematically poisoning me for 5 years. That's a serious accusation, sir. I have medical evidence, recorded confessions, and witnesses." Richard gestured toward Maria, who stepped forward with her phone. "I have her confession recorded," Maria said quietly. "She admitted to giving him muscle relaxants and sedatives to prevent his recovery from a spinal injury." Detective Chen looked at Helen, who hadn't moved or spoken since the police arrived. "Ma'am, I need you to stand up and place your hands behind your back." "This is insane," Helen said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Richard, tell them this is all a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Richard said. was thinking that someone who claimed to love me could be capable of such cruelty. As Detective Chen placed handcuffs on Helen's wrists, the woman who had controlled Richard's life for 5 years began to cry. Not the manipulative tears she'd used so effectively before, but the broken sobs of someone whose carefully constructed world had finally collapsed. "Helen Morrison," Detective Chen said formally, "you're under arrest for attempted murder, assault with a dangerous weapon, and conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda rights continued, Helen looked back at Richard one last time. "I really did love you," she whispered. "I know you believe that," Richard replied sadly. "That's what makes this so tragic." They led Helen away in handcuffs, past the marble columns and crystal chandeliers of the mansion where she'd played the role of devoted caregiver while systematically destroying the man she claimed to love. Richard sat alone in his wheelchair in the sudden silence, staring at the shattered glass on the kitchen floor. 5 years of his life lay in those pieces. 5 years of stolen hope, manufactured despair, and calculated cruelty disguised as love. But for the first time in half a decade, Richard Harrison felt something he'd almost forgotten existed, the possibility of a future that belonged entirely to him. The Harrison mansion buzzed with activity that would have been impossible to imagine during the dark years of Helen's control. Physical therapists worked with Richard in the converted gym. Nutritionists planned meals that actually promoted healing rather than preventing it. And most remarkably, Richard himself moved through his days with energy and purpose that grew stronger each week. The legal proceedings had been swift once Helen's crimes came to light, faced with overwhelming evidence, recorded confessions, medical testimony, financial records showing her increasing control over Richard's assets. Helen had accepted a plea bargain that would keep her in prison for the next 15 years. The trial had been a media sensation, with headlines screaming about the Black Widow of Beverly Hills and the billionaire's deadly fiancée. But Richard had long since stopped reading the coverage. His focus was entirely on the future he was building, literally step by painful step. "Come on, Mr. Harrison," encouraged Dr. Sarah Martinez, his new physical therapist. 5 more steps. I know you can do it." Richard gripped the parallel bars, sweat beading on his forehead as he forced his legs to remember how to bear his weight. The muscle relaxants Helen had fed him for years had done significant damage. But Dr. Peterson had been amazed by how quickly Richard's body began to respond once the chemical suppression was removed. "The human nervous system is remarkably resilient, Doctor," Peterson had explained during one of their weekly sessions. "Your original injury was severe, but it wasn't the complete spinal severance we believed. The drugs Helen administered prevented nerve regeneration and maintained muscle weakness that made natural healing impossible. Now, 6 months clean of Helen's poisonous cocktail." Richard could stand unassisted for nearly 10 minutes and walk short distances with the help of a walker. Dr. Martinez was optimistic that within another year he might regain enough mobility to walk with only a cane. "Beautiful work today," Dr. Martinez said, as Richard completed his session. "Your progress continues to exceed every expectation." I have good motivation," Richard replied, toweling off the sweat from his workout. That motivation had a name: Maria Santos. What had begun as gratitude for her courage in exposing Helen's crimes had slowly deepened into something neither of them had expected: Maria's quiet strength, her genuine compassion, and her refusal to be intimidated by the vast differences in their social positions had awakened feelings in Richard that had nothing to do with dependency or control. "Mr. Harrison," Maria appeared in the gym doorway with perfect timing, as she had for months now. "Your conference call with the Tokyo investors is in 30 minutes. "Thank you." "Maria, and how many times do I have to ask you to call me Richard?" At least once more, she replied, with the smile that had become the highlight of his days. Their relationship had developed slowly, carefully, with Richard determined not to repeat the power imbalances that had made him vulnerable to Helen's manipulation. He'd insisted that Maria continue her education, funding her completion of a business degree while she worked part-time, managing his household affairs. He wanted to be certain that whatever developed between them was based on genuine affection rather than financial necessity. "Richard," Maria's tone became more serious. "There's something I need to tell you. I got the acceptance letter today." Richard's heart sank. Maria had applied to several MBA programs, and he'd encouraged her every step of the way, even knowing it might mean losing her from his daily life. "Stanford?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from her expression. "Full scholarship," she said quietly. "They want me to start in the fall." "Maria, that's incredible news. Stanford's MBA program is one of the best in the world." "I know it is. But Richard, I don't want to leave. Not now, when you're making such amazing progress. Not when." "Not when what?" She looked at him with eyes that held all the words she hadn't yet found the courage to speak. "Not when I'm falling in love with the man you're becoming." The confession hung between them like a bridge they could either cross or leave unbuilt. Richard moved his walker closer to where she stood, reaching out to take her hand. "Maria, I've been in love with you since the day you risked everything to save my life, but I won't be the reason you don't pursue your dreams. You've already sacrificed too much for the Harrison family." "It wouldn't be a sacrifice," she said fiercely. "It would be a choice, my choice, made freely, without coercion or manipulation or financial pressure. And in 10 years, when you realize you gave up Stanford for a man 22 years older who may never fully recover from his injuries." "In 10 years, Maria said, stepping closer to him. "I hope to be celebrating our anniversary and watching our children play in these gardens." The image she painted took Richard's breath away. After 5 years of living in a prison of manufactured helplessness, the idea of building a family based on genuine love and mutual respect seemed almost too wonderful to believe. "Maria," he said quietly, "I need you to understand something. I'm not the same man I was before the accident. That experience, what Helen did to me, it changed me in ways that go beyond physical recovery." "I know," she replied. "You're stronger now, more compassionate, more aware of what really matters in life. I'm also more cautious about trust, more aware of how power can corrupt relationships. I never want you to feel like you can't leave, can't disagree with me, or can't live your own life." "Richard," Maria moved even closer, close enough that he could smell the jasmine perfume she wore. "Do you remember what you told me the day Helen was arrested? You said the only misunderstanding was thinking someone who claimed to love you could be capable of such cruelty." "I remember." "I need you to understand the opposite truth. Someone who genuinely loves you is incapable of such cruelty. Real love doesn't seek to control or diminish. It seeks to uplift and empower." She was right, and Richard knew it. The love he felt for Maria was nothing like the desperate dependency he'd mistaken for love with Helen. This was partnership, mutual respect, the desire to help each other become the best versions of themselves. "Stanford will always be there," Maria continued, "but this moment, this chance to build something beautiful with someone I love, that's irreplaceable." Richard looked into her eyes and saw not the calculating ambition that had driven Helen, but the genuine warmth of someone who loved him not for what he could provide, but for who he was. "Are you sure?" he asked one final time. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He pulled her closer, and when their lips met, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in over 5 years, complete and perfect hope for the future. 3 months later, the Harrison mansion hosted its first celebration in half a decade. Richard could walk down the aisle with only a cane for support, his face radiant with joy as he watched Maria approach in a simple white dress that made her look like an angel. Rosa wept openly in the front row, proud beyond measure that her daughter had found a love built on truth rather than deception. Dr. Peterson was there, amazed by his patient's recovery and delighted to witness such a happy ending to a medical mystery that had challenged everything he thought he knew about spinal injuries. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended only by people who genuinely cared about the couple's happiness rather than their social status or financial worth. As they exchanged vows they had written themselves, Richard and Maria spoke of truth, courage, and the kind of love that sought to heal rather than harm. "Maria Elena Santos," Richard said, his voice strong and clear, "you saved my life not once but twice. First, by having the courage to speak truth to power, and second, by showing me what real love looks like. I promise to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of your trust." "Richard Michael Harrison," Maria replied, "you taught me that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up. I promise to stand beside you through whatever challenges come, as your partner, your equal, and your greatest advocate." When they kissed as husband and wife, the assembled guests erupted in applause that echoed through the mansion's marble halls. But the sound that mattered most to Richard was Maria's soft laughter, filled with pure joy and unlimited possibility. Later, as the sun set over the gardens, where Richard now walked daily, the newlyweds stood together on the terrace, looking out at a future that belonged entirely to them. "Do you ever think about Helen?" Maria asked quietly. "Sometimes," Richard admitted. "I think about how she could have had everything she claimed to want if she'd simply chosen love over control, truth over manipulation. Do you forgive her?" Richard considered the question carefully. "I forgive the broken person who was so afraid of being abandoned that she tried to create a prison disguised as love. But I'll never forgive the deliberate cruelty, the calculated harm, the years she stole from both of us." "She didn't steal this," Maria said, taking his hand. "This moment, this love, this future we're building, she has no claim on any of it." Richard squeezed her hand, marveling at how someone so young could possess such wisdom. "You're right. The best revenge against someone who tried to steal your life is to live it more fully than you ever imagined possible." As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Richard Harrison and Maria Santos Harrison began planning the life they would build together, a life based on truth, mutual respect, and the revolutionary idea that real love seeks to free rather than capture, to heal rather than harm, to empower rather than control. The mansion that had once been a prison had become a home, filled with laughter, hope, and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. And in the master bedroom that had witnessed so much deception and manipulation, Richard and Maria began their first night as husband and wife, knowing that every morning would bring new possibilities, new growth, and new reasons to be grateful for the courage that had saved them both. The conspiracy was over, the truth had won, and love, real, honest, unconditional love, had triumphed over the cruelest deception of all.